Hi there. This is Eric Johnson, the designated broker at Skyline Properties, and today I want to talk to you about the buyer sale of property contingency addendum to the purchase and sale agreement in the Northwest MLS. So that is Form 22B. So what it is when your client, your buyer, um, needs to sell their home in order to complete the purchase of the home they wish to buy, then they need to put the seller on notice that they have to sell that home. And they need to safeguard themselves that if they fail to sell that home, they have the right to back out of the purchase, the home they're looking to purchase, and still get their earnest money back. So it gets a little bit complex. There's a lot of different things going on here. So let's just jump right into the form. So here we go, Form 22B. Always look at the revision date. This is directly from the MLS today. It was revised in July of 2023. Always check that. You want to make sure you're using the current version of the form because rules and laws change occasionally and the forms change accordingly. As always, this date is going to be the date of your purchase and sale agreement. Your buyer and seller and address is all pretty obvious stuff. Now you're going to go down here. So your buyer they're making an offer to buy a home. In that offer, they're saying that they are contingent upon the sale of their property. This is the property they have to sell. So they're going to put in the address, the city, state, and they're going to say when they're going to have it sold. Now, sold, if we look down a little lower here, there's a definition. So, for the purposes of this addendum, the terms sell, selling, and sold shall mean that the buyer has entered into a valid enforceable agreement for the purchase and sale of the buyer's property. Okay, so here where it says that this agreement is contingent on the buyer's selling, there it is, the word selling down here, again up here, selling their property on or before, and this is where you would fill in you can put in a specific date or you can put in a number of days. It defaults to 45 days if you leave it blank. As you've learned from me in other classes, please don't leave it blank. I want you to fill in all of the blanks. Reason being, your buyer isn't aware of things that they don't see filled in. Okay, they don't pay attention to defaults. They don't see the things in the paragraph off to the right. They typically don't even read the language around it. So we want to fill that in because that actually adds a little exclamation point of, hey, buyer, this is important. Read this, pay attention. So anyway, let's just, for purposes of this class, go with the default. Oops. That means that your buyer has 45 days in which to get their home under contract for sale with a buyer. Okay, so that's what that means there. Now, here it talks about listing it. Your buyer will list their property. They have to agree to list it within a reasonable period of time. It defaults again to 5 days. So 5 days, if we were to write up an offer, today is Friday, by the way, for those of you watching, it could be a different day when you are actually watching. But if we wrote this up today and it was accepted today or any day this weekend, they have until next Friday to get their home actively listed on the market. Okay, so it's a pretty short period of time. So you'll want your buyer to be in position to have their home ready to list at any time once they start looking at homes. They should have it neat and tidy and ready because you're going to need to call in a photographer a few days before it goes active. So really it limits the amount of time your client has to actually get actively listed on the market. Okay, if your buyer fails to do this, this is really important, okay? If the buyer fails to do so, this contingency and all other conditions in this agreement, including financing, inspection, or any other contingency, shall be deemed waived, and the closing date shall be 30 days from the buyer's waiver. So if by, again, for the purposes of today's class, because today is a Friday, if by next Friday we do not have this property actively listed. And that means if it's on Saturday, the day after, that's one day too late. We've officially waived this, and we've waived everything else in the purchase and sale agreement that we've got with the seller for the home our buyer wishes to purchase. So that means that they can't back out of that purchase, and they're going to have to come up with cash, or they're going to lose their earnest money if they can't close for any reason, and they won't get that earnest money back. Okay, so that's essentially what this means, is the earnest money is officially at risk on the home that your buyer is looking to purchase. Um, the good news here on Part B, it says that if the buyer has not sold their property, the buyer's property, or given notice waiving this contingency by the end of the contingency period, this agreement shall terminate and the earnest money shall be refunded to the buyer. Okay, so your buyer doesn't have to negotiate on day 45 if they haven't gotten their property sold. They just need to submit a termination form, and they will then get their earnest money back, as they have to do the earnest money form 50 as well. But anyway, they are entitled to get their earnest money back. So that's the good news. So you're going to use Form 90K, is what it says here, where your buyer is going to report if they've satisfied this contingency. They could also put down that they failed to sell their home by day 45, therefore they're terminating. They can also, if they satisfy, meaning they found a buyer, and say that buyer does their inspection and they back out of the purchase of the buyer's home, then the buyer gets to put their home back on the market, and they still have the balance of whatever was left of that 45 days to get it under contract again. There are times when the seller has to approve the offer that your buyer wants to accept. Do not, under any circumstances, have your buyer sign off on accepting an offer that does not meet these two terms. If prior to accepting it, they cannot accept that before getting the seller's consent. Okay, so the one of those is that if the buyer looking to buy your buyer's property is going to be also contingent upon selling their own property, you have to get the seller's consent on the property that your buyer is looking to buy before you accept the offer coming in on your buyer's home. Likewise, if the offer that your buyer wants to accept has a closing date of fewer than 30 days or greater than 45 days from mutual acceptance of the offer, then they have to get approval from the seller of the property they are looking to buy before they accept it. If you accept that offer prior to, in either of those, if you accept an offer that has either of those two issues built into it before you get the seller's consent, you have officially waived this, and therefore you've waived everything else. Okay, kind of what it says up there in Part 1B. So you don't want to do that. It's known as being in default, meaning you've breached your contract. Okay, you can check a box here in Part 3 saying when your buyer is going to start their loan application process. You can either do it within 5 days of mutual acceptance, or you can do it within 5 days of satisfying. That means your buyer has received an offer that they've accepted for the sale of their own home. Definitely choose one of these, check the box, write in the number of days. Okay, don't leave this blank. Your buyer will not read it otherwise. Here is, unfortunately, what is known as the bump clause. Okay. So the seller may keep the property on the market in the contingent status. That's going to be pending contingent. Okay. It'll appear active though on other sites like Zillow and Redfin and things like that. It'll show up as available to them, and so the seller has the right to field other offers until you satisfy or waive your the fact that you need to sell your own property. So if the seller accepts a another offer that's called a bump offer, this the seller will need to get an approval of a Form 39. Hopefully, the buyer broker who's sending in that second offer will send that in. That is a second buyer's addendum, and because that second buyer's addendum makes it really clear to that buyer that, hey, things could happen here that would prevent you from getting this home, but we're going to run through a process. And that process is the seller then presents your buyer with a Form 44. Form 44 says, hey buyer, we are looking to accept another offer. You have the right to either get the home you're selling under contract, meaning satisfied, or you can waive this whole thing, or you know what, you can terminate and we'll give you back your earnest money. So those are the choices. Your buyer will then respond on a Form 46, and then the seller will know which way they're going to go forward. So the faster your client gets their home under contract, in other words, satisfied, then the less likely that the buyer will receive a bump offer. Once you've satisfied, the seller has to change the status from contingent to actual pending or pending inspection at that point. So other buyers will not be making a second buyer offer. Okay, there's not going to be an opportunity to bump. So it's the faster your buyer can get the home they're selling under contract, the better. Now we go into this, it talks about what to do. Once you've satisfied, the buyer shall give notice within 2 days of entering into an agreement to sell their property. Okay, so do that very promptly. Then it goes through the rules of what happens if your buyer is unable to close. There's a survival, so contingency survives. That is, if there are additional days, like we said earlier, the 45-day default. If there's still days available in that 45 days, your buyer can go back on the market and hopefully get under contract again prior to the end of that 45 days. So they have that reinstatement ability here. They can survive. They can terminate as well. So if they're unable to close on the property, if the buyer who's buying their property is unable to close, that means that your buyer is going to be unable to close as well on the home they're looking to buy. That's this one, the contingent one. Then they can offer up a termination. Or if your buyer has the money set aside and they were hoping to sell their home, but they don't have to sell their home in order to close, they can waive. And then there's a new construction clause here as well that changes the waiver date because the certificate of occupancy can be out there a ways into the future. But anyway, that's kind of the options. And then finally, the closing date. So on your original purchase and sale agreement, you're going to mark on the closing date TBD would be my personal preference because this is actually going to dictate it. So this says that the closing date set forth in this addendum shall supersede the closing date set forth in the agreement. And it actually says earlier in here that if we go up to number 5, the sale of the property shall close 3 days after the closing of the sale of the buyer's property. So essentially, the closing date on the offer that your buyer receives for the sale of their home is going to dictate the closing date for the home that your buyer is purchasing. Okay, so hopefully that all makes perfect sense. Now let's move into the Form 22Q. This is a different form of contingent. This is when your buyer was planning to sell their home anyway, and they put it on the market and they've received an offer that they've accepted. It's a pending sale of property. They still want to make that clear to the seller because they are dependent upon the sale of their property in order to close on the home they're looking to purchase, but there's no longer a bump clause. Okay, so this talks about that whole thing, and they have to provide a copy of the pending sale along with their offer. So anyway, this is the form you use to do that. Keeping it pretty simple here. If the property or if the buyer of the property they're looking to sell fails to close, they have the right to terminate on the home they're looking to purchase and get their earnest money back. So it's all covered in here. If if they waive this particular thing by either by violating their contract or by just by determining that they're by doing an action that waives this contingency, then they are also waiving every other contingency as well, just like they did in the 22B. So be careful about waiving, because when you waive, you're waiving your inspection. You're waiving your right to financing. In other words, if you fail to close due to financing, including appraisal, then you'll lose your buyer will lose their earnest money. Okay, so anyway, that's it for your contingencies. It's kind of a quick go on those, but it gives you the basics. I want you to please, please, please call your manager or call me, your designated broker, when you have any questions in this process, including, and most importantly, prior to even writing it up. So let's talk about this. And it doesn't matter if you're representing a buyer or a seller. There could be questions. We want you to ask those before you go forward with this because it is complex. So anyway, that's it. Have a great day.